Okay, today we're going to be talking about adjective clauses. And an adjective clause is quite simply a subordinate clause, and it modifies a noun or a pronoun, just like an adjective would. Nice thing about adjective clauses, or similar to adjectives, is that adjective clauses usually follow the word they modify, so they're typically easy to find, and they typically answer the questions either which one or what kind. And to help you identify them even further, they are usually begin with these relative pronouns. So there's a limited number, which is nice. It helps grammar students usually say, okay, I know what I'm dealing with because of what it begins with. And a relative pronoun is something that relates. It relates, that's where it gets the term from, or connects the adjective clause to the noun or the pronoun that the clause modifies. So let's take a look at a couple here. So this is the espresso. Mr. Brock made the espresso. Okay, so I want to relate the fact that Mr. Brock made that espresso. That's what I want to relate. So I can just write it as this is the espresso that Mr. Brock made. And I went off the edge there. I apologize. This is the espresso that Mr. Brock made. That Mr. Brock made is the subordinating clause. It is the adjective clause because that is modifying espresso. So it tells which espresso I made. This is the espresso that Mr. Brock made. All right, so this is the espresso. The espresso is delicious. So again, I want to relate the fact that the espresso is the delicious to this particular espresso. Now I'm going to use a different construction this time. This is the espresso, comma, which is. Now, the reason I used this construction is because this is one of the confusing things about adjective clauses and relative pronouns that often throw students. Because you remember from our last lecture, or the last presentation, if the independent clause comes first and is followed by the subordinating clause, then there shouldn't be a comma, just like this. There shouldn't be a comma. That is unless the subordinating clause is considered to be non-essential. And that means that you can take the clause out of the sentence and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. This is the espresso. That's all the information that you need. It doesn't, the fact that it is delicious doesn't still answer the question which one, and doesn't tell us what kind. This is the espresso that Mr. Brock made certainly tells us which one. Which espresso is this one? Oh, this is the one that Mr. Brock made. I got it. It tells me which one. So let's look at a couple others here. So we have the idea of the cup of cold espresso. The cup of cold espresso, which I was just drinking, did not thrill me. Now, the nice thing about non-essential clauses is that you have these commas that set them off. These right here and right here. Those are nice. Commas are nice in just about any type of sentence that students are working on because commas set things apart. They let us know that this phrase or this clause, or in some cases this appositive, this is not essential information. So I can, in theory, just take it out of the sentence, and the sentence makes perfect sense all on its own. The cup of cold espresso did not thrill me. Right. That's all the information you need to know, and quite frankly, it's information that everyone should know about cold espresso. I drank the bland cup of espresso, which filled me with remorse. So again, this case, the essential information is this independent clause. I drank the bland cup of espresso. It already tells us which one. And it also tells us what kind. It was bland. Which one? The bland one, right? So, which filled me with remorse is additional information that is non-essential, which is why it is set off by the comma. It's still an adjective clause, right? Because if I bring it back up here and I want to, draw a line to it, which fill me with remorse is telling me which espresso. Which espresso filled you with remorse? The bland one, right? The cold cup of espresso. Which espresso? The one which I was just drinking, right? It's still answering the question. So it's still acting like an adjective clause. It's just not important information. I can take it out, and the meaning of the sentence does not change. That's the critical thing you have to remember about commas in sentences, is that they indicate whether the information is essential or restrictive or not. All right, so let's look at another one. The coffee that I like has been sold. All right, so I could find the subordinating clause in this sentence that I like, and I could take it out, right? The coffee has been sold. But then that takes out the information of which coffee are you talking about? The coffee that I like. So again, this, because it is an adjective clause, it's going to be modifying a noun in the sentence. Which coffee? The coffee that I like. Right. That's the one that was sold. I don't care about the other coffees. They can get sold all day long. The teacher who teaches you grammar wants you to understand it. Right. So again, let's find the subordinating clause in this sentence. Who teaches you grammar? Right. It's not set off by commas. So you must assume this is essential information. And when I take it out, you can see that it is. The teacher wants you to understand it. Well, which teacher? It could be the math teacher, because I quite frankly don't know from this what they want me to understand. They want me to understand it. So this is essential on two levels. It tells you which teacher, and it also tells you what it is. So it is very essential information, clearly an adjective clause, because it is modifying the word right before it. But you can see why it's not set off by commas, which is, again, a question that I often get from students. Hopefully you'll start to pick up after the next couple that there is a typical relative pronoun that gets a comma, the rest don't. And let's look at a couple here and just see if we can identify them. A snorkel is a tube that lets a diver breathe underwater. So let's see if we can figure out what the subordinating clause is. Now, of course, we can go back to our list and say, well, let's just find the relative pronoun, which is that, and say, aha, we found it. The problem with that is that sometimes you might have a demonstrative pronoun there, sometimes it's an interrogative pronoun, and it can throw students off. So you still want to look for that second verb. A snorkel is. So we have a snorkel is. Subject, verb, right? A snorkel is a tube, right? That is the whole independent clause right there. That lets a diver breathe underwater is the rest of the sentence. It is the subordinating clause. It tells us it has both a subject and a verb, and yet it is important because it tells us what kind of tube it is, right? It's a tube that lets a diver breathe underwater. All right, here we have the team's mascot, which is a horse, is called Renegade. And again, we could go back to our list of relative pronouns and say, okay, where's the relative pronoun in this list? It's which. How about that? Yay for us. Well, the problem is that you may not always know that you're dealing with adjective clauses. And so therefore, you can't depend upon the fact that it begins with a relative pronoun as the way to find it. You're still going to need to look for that second verb in the sentence to see if there is a second clause in the sentence. So here, the team's mascot is connected to this verb right there. The team's mascot is called Renegade. Now, hopefully you've noticed, hey, commas, yay. That means that this is a non-essential clause. I can take it out. The team's mascot is called Renegade. I already know what mascot I'm talking about. I already know, this answers the question, what kind of mascot is it, right? But I already know which mascot we're talking about. So I can take it out, and it's non-essential information. But clearly, it is still an adjective clause. Let's look at another one. Gwendolyn Brooks is the writer who is the poet laureate of Illinois. Now, the independent clause here is Gwendolyn Brooks is the writer, right? It stands on its own. We can say it and no one will look at it as askance. But again, it doesn't tell us which writer she is. She's just the writer in this sentence. And so we have this who telling us she is the writer who is the poet laureate of Illinois. That is specifically which writer is she. People whose library books are overdue must pay fines. Now in this case, you have, because it's an adjective clause, it's going to be pointing right up next to the word in front of it, right? Which people? Those whose books are overdue must pay fines. But again, this is a subordinating clause that is right in the middle of the independent clause, right? So we have people must pay fines. That's the independent clause. People must pay fines. So we'll connect them there. Must pay, right? People must pay fines. That stands on its own. Whose library books are overdue cannot stand on its own, right? That makes it a subordinating clause. Let's look at another one. All right. Sometimes you will get subordinating clauses that begin with a relative pronoun, and the relative pronoun in of itself is non-essential. You can take that relative pronoun out, and it doesn't really change the meaning of the sentence. So the person we saw at the market was following us. The person that we saw at the market, the person whom we saw at the market was following us. We can leave it in or we can take it out, and it really doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. And so we're left here with a subordinating clause, we saw at the market, and yet it is still an adjective clause. It is modifying person, right? But we've lost this relative pronoun. Just to show you that you can't always depend upon the relative pronoun to be able to identify if it is an adjective clause. Okay, that is your adjective clause presentation.